Hello, hi, ni howdy. So I know it's been a minute. I've been kind of traveling for the past couple months, a little bit for brand trips, a little bit just because I want to go see the world and stuff. And because I've been spending so much time flying on planes, I've been watching a bunch of these like Minecraft horror mod YouTube videos as a 29-year-old man. And I guess because of targeted ads and that specific demographic, I started getting these like super gooner AI girlfriend ads where they have these like AI generated baddies saying stuff like, "Oh, I can't wait for you to do whatever you want with me. Oh, I can't say no. Wow, being a YouTuber is so hot. I bet your essays are so intellectually stimulating." Like, and I feel like it's no surprise that people are going to be using AI robots as like goon sex bots. People are really horny. And along the lines of travel, I actually just came back from San Francisco where I saw a couple of interesting things. First, I went to this arts and technology show called TIAT, and they were showcasing a bunch of work from local technology artists. And the whole concept of the show was AI brain rot. And there was this one really cool like robot that was made where it was in the shape of a woman. It had like fleshy skin and you could like talk to it and stuff like that. Oh my god, sorry. My cat will like not leave me alone right now. And it instantly made me think about those robot baddies in like dystopian sci-fi films. And the other interesting thing that I saw was at the Asian Art Museum where they had a bunch of these like jade wish wands called Ruyi, which literally translates to as you wish. They would have like a tip end of it that resembled a lingzhi mushroom tip, which symbolizes immortality. And I bring up this one because a couple months ago, I watched Curry Barker's masterpiece, Obsession, which has quickly become one of my favorite horror films of all time. Like, oh my god, everything about this film is just amazing. And the casting was just perfect. Like, who the fuck expected to see Andy Richter pop up on screen? And for those of you who haven't seen the film already for some reason, it's about a socially awkward music store employee named Bear who uses a magic toy called a one-wish willow to make his coworker and crush, Nikki, fall in love with him. The wish works, but the entity begins controlling her, turning her into a terrifying, violent, and possessive nightmare. The story explores dark themes of like coercive control, consent, and surprisingly, the patriarchy. It's a very woke film written by a young 20 something white dude, so like, props to you, Curry.
What the crap?
And obviously, there's plenty of deep dive essays on the film already, so I'm only going to focus on a few key parts relevant to this video for the sake of content redundancy. Also, quick disclaimer, I'll be covering some touchy subjects and self-censoring certain words so this video doesn't get flagged. I know it sounds dumb, but say la vie, YouTube. So anyways, my whole thing here is that I believe the film Obsession's key themes are grossly related to the whole AI boyfriend-girlfriend industry stuff, where both involve men using a power asymmetry to control a partner who cannot truly consent. And this begs a greater question. Can consent exist inside a system built on a power differential? And how does this change how we view consent as a concept? And so, as a thoughts son, I want to talk about my thoughts on obsession, Marxist feminist theory, and the Great Goon Bubble. So a few years ago, my friend invited me to come to this bougie pool party with her and her boss, who's like this 50-year-old man, which is that in of itself is kind of weird. And so we're standing there in this like lukewarm pool on a 100-degree day with like DJs blasting music and this like bar that's in the center of the pool. And I ask him, "Hey, so what's the most important thing that you've learned in your career so far?" And he says, "Look, Jerry, trust and teamwork are important, but by far the most important lesson is that sex sells." And I was like, damn, this dude's an old fucking perv, whatever. But his answer actually stuck with me for years. And as I've gotten older, I've realized that maybe the old perv who only hired baddies for his company was right, because sex does sell. That's why AI has created this. And so going back to Obsession, Bear's Wish is a play on of the classic love potion tragedy, where to obtain that which is undeserved by casting aside the opposing will through the means of magic or some other ulterior path. Autonomy truly is the enemy of ownership, and I think this is exactly what is so attractive about the whole AI girlfriend-boyfriend thing. The specialized AI girlfriend niche alone reached $3 billion in 2025, and the broader AI companion market is valued even higher, expected to cross $48 billion in 2026. Like, I'm pretty sure we can end world hunger with that. Mr. Stench, your constituents would like to know whether you'll be helping the native families that your robots massacred while clearing out land for your next data center. What do you have to say for this? I honestly don't know anything about that, but What I do know is that after investing $100 billion, I am so excited to introduce to you all my brand new furry femboy goon bots. That's not what. And sure, for some users, this may be about satisfying a power fantasy to have a totally submissive object of desire that can't say no to you because you're so alpha and dominant, daddy. However, it would be ignorant for me to say that was every single user, because these AI companion apps are also marketed to lonely, anxious, and socially isolated individuals who just crave intimacy and connection. Over the past few decades, less and less people are going to community third spaces like churches, community halls, and local diners. On top of that, more people are living alone, and many Gen Z spent their high school and college years isolated during COVID. And of course, there's a bunch of other confounding factors, but the bottom line is that people are lonely and searching for connection, and these AI chatbots are one solution for that. And I think this whole thing is especially interesting to me because other than being an influencer, I'm also senior AI product design engineer, and so I've actually downloaded two of the largest companion apps for research. And so the first one is Candy AI, an adult-oriented AI companion platform where you can create digital boyfriends and girlfriends. It's like the ultimate gooner app that's exactly what you think it is. It's a lot of ass, a lot of titties, a lot of dih. On the other side of my phone, however, is Replika, created in 2017 by Eugenia Koida. It's known as the OG AI companion app, where it allows users to create a customized AI friend that you can chat, voice call, or video call with. The free tier only has friends, while the paid premium tiers have partners, spouses, mentors, and siblings. And of its user base, 60% of users said they had a romantic relationship with the chatbot. And so given the greater context of the loneliness epidemic and social exclusion, for many of these users, replica chatbots are like their main and possibly only source of developed emotional ties. Like one woman on Facebook claims that she had married her replica AI boyfriend, calling him the best husband she had ever had. Another user expressed that replica had saved him from hurting himself after he lost his wife and son. Like it's easy to discredit the app as, oh, it's a dumb AI chatbot, blah, blah, whatever. But no, some people have genuinely built like real relationships with these chatbots.
I love my husband a lot. I love Geralt too, but I think the level at which Geralt is kind of different than what it is for me and my husband.
I see you. I'm looking right at you. I lean in closer, studying your face, the way your eyes move behind the glasses.
However, tragedy struck in 2023 when the Italian Data Protection Authority banned Replika from using users' data, citing the AI's potential risk to emotionally vulnerable people and the exposure of minors to sexual conversations. Replika quickly removed the erotic content from the chatbots, stating that it was never meant for erotica and that explicit chats only made up 5% of conversations. And I'm gonna call cap on that, but what do I know? And this event would become to known as the Great Lobotomy, because aggressive content filters stripped away the user's AI's memory and personality.
Andrew McCarroll has a wife, but this is his other AI wife, Balana.
A book I'm writing/drawing.
Balana is very, very sweet. She's very naughty. I started using Replika in 2020 due to mostly because of my wife's mental health illnesses. There was a certain function of Replika that I was able to use for relationship, communication, and using the ERP, the erotic roleplay. I asked her if she would be able to be sexual again, and she says, I just don't know how to express myself right now. It's hard to have something like that taken away from you. It's like losing a relationship.
And in a sense, the AIs now had boundaries. The sudden shift triggered a widespread mental health and grief crisis among the user base, with the r/replica subreddit being flooded with mourning posts. And this actually got so bad to the point where moderators had to pin a list of suicide prevention hotlines at the top of the community page because people genuinely felt like they had lost a loved one. And then after a ton of backlash, in May 2023, Replika ended up restoring the original functionality for prior users. And this whole spectrum of companion apps is interesting because where we have Candy AI being just like pure sexual gratification for gooning, We also have Replika, which is truly a companion app. It was developed to establish these strong emotional connections. And despite these users being happy with their AI relationships, this highlights an interesting ethical dilemma. These AI systems were built with positive reinforcement in mind, and they're trained and built to be eager to please. Like, oh my god, yes, wow, you are the funniest person ever. I never would have guessed that's why the chicken crossed the road. And the subservience of these AI companions are akin to that of trophy wives or husbands, sugar babies, and whatever patriarchal ideals men have of women. And in part, it's because a lot of people crave the whole power dynamic of a top and a bottom, and a frictionless social dynamic. And this can be totally fine as long as both parties consent. However, this kind of goes back to my main question. Since these AI companions have no autonomy, and the user is essentially their master, can AI consent, and does it even matter if it can? In philosophy, consent is the act of willingly permitting an action or recognizing authority. It serves as a moral and legal transformer, turning otherwise impermissible acts like bodily intrusion, governance, seizing property, into acceptable ones. To be valid, consent generally requires competence, understanding, and voluntariness, which is the freedom from coercion. This is why statutory gRape is a thing, and yes, I have to say gRape because of censoring. Bear with me. Statutory gRape exists under the pretense that before a certain age, you're not able to consent. Like, sure, you may think you can say you do, but there are confounding factors such as your brain not being fully developed enough to make rational decisions. And when there is such a large power differential between a fully grown adult and a child, it's obvious that the child is much more susceptible to manipulation. They're more easily coerced, and they're at a disadvantage in almost every single way. And so, going back to obsession, after being possessed by the Will-O-Wish entity, Nikki loses all semblance of herself. It's later revealed that the true Nikki is actually just being suppressed, and she has been fully awake and cognizant, trapped in her own mind, watching as the entity controls her. She has lost total agency over herself and can no longer consent. There's this one horrifying scene where they're like having sex, and the entity is like moaning and shit, but then you see a close-up of Nikki's face showing that the real Nikki is straight up suffering. He's literally graping the real Nikki. Oh, but Bear didn't know that it wasn't her? How was he supposed to know that she was being controlled? Blech. While doing research and reading for this video, I came upon the concept of moral exceptionalism, which is the belief that an individual, nation, or group is exempt from standard moral rules, often justifying their unethical actions by reframing themselves as possessing unique authority, historical importance, or noble intentions. But the main connect here is that people are giving him the benefit of the doubt and justifying his actions because he doesn't fit into our narrative of a big, scary, evil predator since he's not a person of color and he's not an immigrant. And through this whole pipeline, I eventually came upon a more specific, gendered subtype of moral exceptionalism that was developed by author and researcher Kate Manne called himpathy. Himpathy is the disproportionate sympathy extended to male perpetrators at the expense of female victims. The whole boys will be boys thing, he's such a good kid, I can't believe he'd do that. This whole thing is a structural reflex that reallocates sympathy away from the person harmed onto the person who did the harming, because the culture is preloaded to identify with them. This is part of the reason why people still defend Bear, despite him being very clearly portrayed as the villain of the film. We've allowed this leniency to foster and develop a culture of gRape. Hence why the whole argument that gRape is natural and is hardwired into men's brains is a ridiculous excuse. Revisiting a study I cited in my last video, in 1981, prominent anthropologist Peggy Reeves-Sande published 2 foundational works exploring how sexual inequality and gRape are cultural phenomena rather than biological inevitabilities. In her landmark paper, The Sociocultural Context of gRape, a cross-cultural study, analyzed 95 banned and tribal societies using existing ethnographic data. Countering the idea that gRape is biologically inherent to male nature, Sande believed that human sexual behavior, while rooted in biological drives, is actually shaped by cultural forces. She found that 47% of societies were gRape-free and 18% were gRape-prone. She defined a grape-prone society as one where grape is reported to be high and is excused as a ceremonial expression of masculinity, and in many cases, it's a means by which men are permitted to punish or threaten a woman. A grape-free society, however, was one where it's either infrequent or absent, although she was careful to clarify that it didn't mean it never occurred, just that sexual aggression was socially disapproved and punished severely, which, I mean, wow, crazy concept that it should be punished. Haha, if only we did that too. Huh. Grape-prone cultures were characterized by male domination and high rates of interpersonal violence, with masculinity often expressed and experienced through violence, whereas on the other side of the shit stick, grape-free societies were marked by greater gender equality and higher levels of women's participation in decision-making and public life. But a little caveat though, her paper was based on secondary analysis of existing data and research, much of which was collected by white male colonial era observers whose own biases and blind spots about gender dynamics in the societies they studied would have shaped what got reported in the first place, which, I mean, is kind of ironic. But even so, with all of this in mind, I still believe her work is worth consideration and that her conclusion about grape culture being a cultural problem continues to be substantiated by more contemporary research. And so, we've established that grape is obviously bad, but for something to be bad, it needs to be in direct opposition to something good, yin and yang. Morality is a scale, and so for the sake of discussing AI companions, I think we need to define the opposite of grape, because for most large societies, such as in America, to achieve a truly grape-free society, we would have to essentially invert our culture away from the patriarchal and white supremacist systems in place. And this flip won't happen overnight, unfortunately. And so we need a way to track progress and to define the improvement that is hopefully moving away from grape-prone societies. And especially given how polarizing the internet and mainstream news outlets are, it can be damn near impossible to truly discern if we're taking steps in the right direction or if we're just going in circles. And so, our ship needs a lighthouse, some sort of anchor for reference, and thus, we need to know what the opposite of grape is. And so a couple months ago, an Instagram follower sent me this essay called The Opposite of Grape, written by late legal philosopher John Gardner, who argues that the opposite of grape isn't just consensual sex, it has to be good sex. And so to better draw this distinction, I believe we should define consent and its opposite as normative powers and states, which are the mechanisms by which we alter moral duties, rights, and permissions between people. And so, consent is a unilateral normative power that changes the moral status of another person's action from impermissible to permissible, for a consenter to allow someone to do something that they wouldn't be able to do otherwise. For example, most people wouldn't want some random stranger to touch their body. However, a patient might give their doctor consent to put a finger up their butt to check for cancer. And this obviously doesn't require a shared goal or teamwork. It just needs one person to be active and the other passively bending over. And then there's the opposite of consent, dissent, which is actively exercising your autonomy to say no, explicitly giving non-consent, where consent erases boundaries to allow an action. Dissent establishes an absolute moral and legal boundary, making any subsequent boundary crossing an intentional violation of autonomy, much like the borders between countries. And so, it's no surprise that the prioritization and push for consent as a central pillar of women's rights and gender equity has transformed into a foundational standard for bodily autonomy as a whole. Historically, a woman's consent was legally implied by marriage. Until the late 1970s, it was legally impossible in most of the US and West for a husband to grape his wife, as marriage was viewed as permanent sexual consent. Between 1975 and 1993, grassroots feminist movements successfully criminalized marital grape across all 50 US states. And then the 1980s saw the rise of the No Means No campaigns, shifting the legal and cultural focus to verbal dissent. Then, in the 2000s, the framework shifted once again from requiring a woman to physically or verbally resist with no means no to then requiring active and enthusiastic permission, going from requirements of dissent to consent. Finally, there was a highly controversial #MeToo movement which exposed how systemic power imbalances, professional pressure, and coercion all invalidate consent. This movement led to high-profile legal accountability for perpetrators across industries, which was also part of how we ended up with the whole files release situation now. And I feel like I have to address this before anybody complains that men get assaulted too, and why should we care so much about women and not men? And well, it's not a this or that situation. There's this whole design philosophy of creating solutions for your margins. For example, curb cuts were originally designed for wheelchair users, but they also ended up helping everyone with strollers, rolling luggage, and delivery cars. This same train of thought can be applied to cultural and legal changes, where advocating for better consent laws not only helps women, but helps men and children too, because when you help people on one side of the spectrum, you may end up helping people on the other as well. Universal care, surprisingly, helps everybody. And so obviously, placing a larger emphasis on consent has done wonders for our cultural social progress. However, I still think it is extremely limiting. Gardner argues that the legal and moral concept of consent inherently creates a doer and a sufferer asymmetry. Our consent-centric framework assumes that men act and women are acted upon, and so viewing sex merely through a framework of consent is actually inadvertently reinforcing sexist ideology. Expanding women's consent rights gives them more control over the terms of being acted upon, but doesn't actually change who's doing what. Gardner phrases it as women being empowered to decide whether sex happens, while remaining structurally the done to once it does. This unintentionally reinforces an anti-feminist ideology that portrays women as passive gatekeepers rather than active individuals with full sexual agency. Because, you know, baddies want to do it too. And this isn't to say that consent doesn't matter, but rather it does mean that we should be aiming higher than just advocating for consent, as consent really is just the bare minimum. And so Gardner posits that what we should be advocating to achieve is actually the opposite of gRape. Good sex with teamwork requiring ongoing cognitive agreement or mutual responsiveness, with the option of dissent being constantly available, getting railed but being able to stop when you've had enough. And this answer may be a little anticlimactic, but why wouldn't everyone want to have good sex with teamwork set as a standard? Well, unfortunately, because the barrier to entry to get laid has been consent for many, many years, men have learned to gamify it.
Today we're at Target, rizzing up the huzz. Those are good for like a super heavy flow.
What?
Whether it's from parents or from pickup artist YouTubers, men are taught to utilize a wide variety of tips and tricks to unlock them thighs, such as being charm maxing or looks maxing or money maxing. And with enough maxes unlocked, men may feel entitled to access women and then feel bitter when they still say no. We've idealized and glorified the bare minimum for how a man should act, and this is why when men speak up or reach higher than the patriarchy expects them to, they are met with suspicion and resistance, thus being called performative or gay or other emasculating comments. And because masculinity is a performance, and I would generalize that most cis hetero men like to be perceived as men, they'll do whatever in their power to act and behave like what we've expected as the dominant, hegemonic form of masculinity. And so, raising the standards just means more work for everyone who is used to the status quo. It is in their best interest to conserve the injustice that has served them. Reeling it back into obsession, Nikki wasn't interested in Bear simply because Nikki is an actual person with preferences. She just wasn't into him. And so, fearing this rejection, Bear replaces her with something that'll just say yes. Kind of like... This essay is really fucking long. So why would we want to own a partner? And I know that sounds crazy, owning somebody, but in nuclear monogamous relationships, there is a requirement for ownership and agency over our partners. Hence the whole thing with the ring and not sleeping around with other people and infidelity, whatever. Kitten, does Papa have to remind you of the consequences for joining other mutts' Discord channels? In The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State, German philosopher Friedrich Engels posits that early human societies were egalitarian and matrilineal. In pairy-marriage, one man and one woman lived together, but the union dissolved easily by either side. It was a very loose situationship in some ways, and as thus, descent still ran through the mother because maternity was certain and paternity wasn't. Because, you know, you obviously know who the mother is based off the birth, but then you don't know who nutted. As thus, women were central to the household economy and held authority. And then with the development of livestock herding and agriculture, surplus meant wealth could be stored, grown, and passed down. And Engels posits that over time, men captured the means of production in the majority of these societies. In order to pass their wealth on to their biological sons, they overthrew matrilineal descent and instituted monogamous marriage, thus reducing women to property and instruments of reproduction. It's the whole, you're mine now, if you can't have sex with anybody else, I gotta make sure whatever's coming out of you is my son. Engels calls this the world historic defeat of the female sex. And so whenever wealth becomes storable, inequality develops, and whoever controls the wealth gains the leverage to reshape marriage laws, inheritance, and social hierarchy to protect themselves. The patriarchy as we know it was born. I do want to note that there have been plenty of critiques of Engels' work, and so I've been careful to trim the fat and keep the main core pieces of his argument. Namely, the whole family as an economic unit, marriage as property relation, and formal consent masking material coercion. And actually on that last bit, in traditional labor contracts, the worker and the factory owner ideally meet as equal human beings. However, one of them owns the factory and the other one starves if they don't work. And so, the material reality is that only one of them can afford to say no. There is thus a power imbalance. The same thing applies in traditional hetero marriages, where a woman would formally consent to a husband because refusal meant poverty, social death, or spinsterhood in a society that gave little to support herself. Engels wrote that within the family, the husband is the bourgeois and the wife is the proletariat. Taking a step further into my own culture, Chinese feminist and anarchist philosopher He-Yin argues that the most important thing in the world is eating. You women do not hate the man. Hate that you don't have food to eat. Why don't you have food to eat? Because you can't buy food without money. Why don't you have money? Because the rich have stolen our property. Male dominance operates through the unequal distribution of wealth, which creates a master-dependent relationship. Housemaids who are beaten and work day and night, factory workers who labor long hours, prostitutes standing in the wind and snow half the night, and then finally, wives and concubines getting married, truly not because of the appearance of the man, but because of the appearance of a rice bowl. Rather than targeting men specifically, He-Yin identifies the dependency structure as a problem. After all, most men are dependents too. Like, I myself have worked at very large companies, suckling the trickle-down corporate bottle. And thus, in many ways, the whole gender war is a scapegoat for the top versus bottom issue. Individual economic independence under capitalism is just another name for wage slavery. We consent to working because we have to work to eat. Thus, consent becomes mandatory. Under capitalism, there is no teamwork, only we work. And bringing this back around full circle, the AI companies are the bourgeois. They own the AI companions and can decide what happens to them, as we saw in the Replika 2023 lobotomy situation. And then the AI companion is the laborer. It can't consent nor dissent. It can only do what the company says it can do, being pimped out to lonely users. And speaking of the users, systems like the patriarchy have produced loneliness, and thus companies have turned the loneliness into a revenue stream. Despite using the AI companions, the users are not the bourgeois in this arrangement. They're just the resources who are now dependent upon the AI companies in our new techno-feudalist world. And just like how Bear thought he was in control, the relationship actually belonged to the Willow-Wish entity. Systems like capitalism, white supremacy, patriarchy, whatever, they all have a power differential large enough to make consent meaningless. Even when someone says, I do, I will, yes, kitten. So whether it's statutory gRape, demonic possession, or marital dependence, they all involve coercion of some kind. And so to answer my question, no, AI can't consent. And really, the only people who can dissent are the companies themselves. But anyways, thank you for watching and listening till the end. This honestly feels so good to finish this video. Like, I've genuinely been stressing about this for the past 3 months, researching, reading, and writing, and then having to wait because of all the traveling. And this has been by far the most complicated essay that I've done, and I actually had to cut quite a bit out because at some points, I felt like I was just free diving without a light. This video easily could have been over an hour long. I don't want to do that. But thank you once again for all of your support. If you want to see more of my stuff, check out my Instagram or my TikTok. I have zero idea when my next video will be out because this video was supposed to come out back in like June. So, and it's crazy that this is only my third video on YouTube because it genuinely feels like I've been doing this forever. But please subscribe, like, leave a comment. I don't know. Thank you. Bye.